Every great story begins with a choice, and Solomon's story begins with one that changed the course of history. Among all the kings who ruled the earth, few began their reign with such humility and purpose. His life was not only a tale of wealth or power, but of a heart that longed to understand what truly pleases God. He was the son of David, the man who had walked with divine favor, fought mighty battles, and left behind a legacy that still echoed through Israel. Yet Solomon's calling was different. Where his father had conquered with the sword, Solomon would lead with wisdom. His reign would be defined not by war, but by peace. And at the center of that peace stood a young king, uncertain yet sincere, bowing before heaven and asking for guidance rather than glory. From the moment he ascended the throne, Solomon faced the weight of expectation. His father's victories had united the tribes, but unity demanded more than victory. It demanded vision. The kingdom stretched wide and prosperous, yet its stability depended on a ruler who could see beyond politics and wealth, one who could judge rightly, govern fairly, and lead with integrity. Solomon felt the enormity of that responsibility pressing upon him. He was not driven by ambition, but by reverence. In his heart, he knew that wisdom was greater than strength, and understanding was richer than gold. So he turned not to men for counsel, but to God, seeking the only source that could equip him to rule with truth. His early days as king revealed the depth of his humility. Instead of demanding tribute or asserting dominance, he sought to know the will of God. He visited sacred places, offered sacrifices, and prayed with sincerity, aware that without divine direction, even a throne built on strong foundations could crumble. This humility drew heaven's attention, for God is drawn to those who recognize their dependence on him, and in Solomon's quiet prayers, heaven heard something rare, a king asking not for riches or vengeance, but for wisdom, to serve his people well. That prayer would become the key to his greatness, the moment when divine purpose met human surrender. The nation looked to Solomon with anticipation. Israel had known many leaders, but none like this young man whose heart burned with such devotion. Peace spread across the land, crops flourished, and the people lived without fear. Beneath the calm of those early years, something extraordinary was taking shape. A kingdom that reflected the order and beauty of divine wisdom. Solomon's reign would become a light to the nations, a living example of what happens when human authority aligns with heavenly purpose. Every decision, every judgment, every word of counsel carried the fragrance of divine understanding. His wisdom would soon astonish the world, but it began with something far simpler: humility before God. Those early days remind every listener that greatness begins not with self-confidence, but with surrender. True wisdom is not a possession to be claimed. It is a gift granted to those who seek truth with a humble heart. Solomon Schaus' example invites us to look within ourselves, to ask what we truly desire when given the chance to request anything from God. Will we ask for things that fade, or for understanding that endures? His story stands as an invitation, calling us to seek the kind of wisdom that builds not only kingdoms, but souls. If stories like this inspire your heart and draw you closer to timeless truth, remember to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment sharing what part of Solomon's journey speaks to you most. Your support helps bring more messages of faith, wisdom, and reflection to all who seek light in a world that often forgets where true wisdom begins. Night had fallen over Gibeon, the vast sky stretching in silence above the sleeping camp. The scent of burned offerings lingered in the cool air, rising like whispers of devotion toward the unseen heavens. Solomon had come here not to display his kingship, but to seek the presence of the Almighty. The altar before him bore the marks of sacrifice, a symbol of surrender and gratitude. As the flickering flames dimmed and the people drifted into rest, Solomon remained alone, his thoughts restless and his heart wide open. He was a young king standing at the threshold of greatness, yet he understood that his strength would mean nothing without divine wisdom guiding it. The peace around him did not still his mind, it only deepened his longing to hear from God. In the stillness of that night, as the fire faded into embers, a divine presence filled the air with an indescribable calm. Sleep carried Solomon into a realm where heaven and earth seemed to touch, and in that sacred space, God spoke to him. The words were both simple and infinite. "Ask what I shall give you." It was not a test, nor a trap, but a window into the heart of the man who would lead Israel. Offered limitless possibilities, Solomon did not reach for wealth, victory, or a long life. He did not seek vengeance for his enemies or glory for his name. He asked instead for understanding, to judge rightly, to discern between good and evil, to govern with justice worthy of God's people. That single request revealed the essence of his soul, a ruler who valued discernment over dominion, insight over influence. Divine pleasure stirred at the humility of that prayer. Heaven rejoiced not because Solomon asked for wisdom, but because he asked with a pure motive, to serve rather than to be served. God saw within him a desire to reflect divine justice in human form, to make his throne an extension of heavenly order. The response he received overflowed with grace beyond measure. Solomon was told that because he had asked for understanding and not for gain, he would receive not only a wise and discerning heart, but also the riches and honor that he had not sought. His wisdom would surpass all who came before and all who would follow. It was a promise that would shape history and a reminder that when one's priorities align with divine will, blessings flow freely without demand. Morning light broke over Gibeon with a gentle glow, bathing the altar in gold as Solomon awoke from the dream. The encounter had left him changed. It was more than a vision. It was a covenant between heaven and earth sealed within his spirit. His heart was filled with gratitude and reverence, and as he returned to Jerusalem, he carried not only the memory of divine speech, but a profound awareness of responsibility. He offered sacrifices of thanksgiving, not out of obligation but overflowing gratitude, knowing that he had been heard by the Creator of all. The people may not have known what had occurred in the night, but they would soon see the evidence of it in every decision their king made. Wisdom, once given, is not a possession, but a calling. For Solomon, it became a mantle that demanded constant reflection and humility. The gift he received was not a collection of insights, but a living connection to divine truth. With every judgment, he would draw from a source beyond human comprehension. His reign would become an unfolding revelation of what happens when a heart remains teachable before God. The purity of that moment at Gibeon marked the highest point of Solomon's communion with the Almighty. It was the hour when human frailty met divine generosity and became transformed into spiritual greatness. As word spread of the king's discernment, people began to look upon Solomon with awe. His presence inspired confidence, and his decisions brought peace where conflict once brewed. Israel stood united under his wisdom, its people seeing justice administered with clarity and compassion. The dream had not been an illusion. It was manifesting in daily governance, in the way Solomon spoke, listened, and acted. Wisdom, when rooted in humility, becomes contagious. It lifts nations, restores order, and turns fear into trust. Even so, Solomon knew that wisdom was not self-sustaining. It required constant renewal through faith and obedience. The temptation of kings is to believe that insight once granted remains forever secure, but wisdom thrives only when nourished by humility. Solomon, at this stage, still remembered the voice that spoke to him at Gibeon and the sacred fear it inspired. His success did not blind him to his dependence on God, and for a time his heart remained steady, his motives pure, and his actions worthy of the gift he had been given. The story of that night would echo across generations as a reminder that true greatness begins in surrender. Power gained through humility bears a different fragrance. It brings peace instead of pride, purpose instead of ambition. Solomon's request pleased God because it was born of sincerity and service. The same divine principle endures. When hearts seek wisdom for the sake of others, heaven responds with abundance. The dream at Gibeon was not the end of Solomon's spiritual journey, but the beginning of a path where divine favor and human responsibility would walk hand in hand. Dawn spread across Jerusalem as the people awoke to the rhythm of a kingdom at peace. Within the royal courts, word of Solomon's wisdom had begun to circulate, carried by whispers from one household to another. The city hummed with hope, its citizens sensing that the new king would rule with fairness unlike any before him. They had seen leaders who commanded fear, but now they saw a ruler who inspired trust. Solomon's wisdom, bestowed in that dream at Gibeon, was not an ornament of intellect, but a living flame illuminating every decision he made. One morning, two women were brought before the throne, both weary and desperate. Each claimed to be the mother of the same child, and each swore her truth with tears and trembling voices. It was a situation no law could easily resolve, no testimony could fully verify. The tension in the chamber was thick, the lives of the innocent and the guilty entwined in uncertainty. Solomon listened, his gaze calm yet piercing. He did not rush to judgment, for wisdom does not speak before understanding has settled. Then, in a moment that would be remembered for all time, he gave a command that startled everyone present. "Bring me a sword." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. Guards stepped forward, their faces uncertain, yet they obeyed. Solomon's next instruction seemed unthinkable: divide the living child and give half to each woman. Gasps rippled through the court. Fear and disbelief filled the room. But wisdom often appears harsh before it reveals its mercy. One woman cried out in anguish, pleading that the child be spared and given to the other, while the second woman remained silent, her heart unmoved. Solomon's eyes softened, for the truth had spoken without words. He ordered the child to be given to the one who begged for his life, declaring her the true mother. Justice was restored, and compassion triumphed over deceit. That single judgment spread through the nation like light piercing darkness. Israel saw in Solomon not merely a king, but a vessel of divine insight. His ability to discern truth in the most delicate matters gave the people confidence that righteousness dwelt within the throne. They began to understand that wisdom is not merely knowledge of right and wrong, but the spiritual sensitivity to see beyond appearances. Justice in Solomon's court was not mechanical but moral. It sought to restore balance, not merely to punish. As days turned into years, Solomon's reputation as a wise ruler grew beyond Israel's borders. Foreign dignitaries sent envoys to witness the brilliance of his governance, and even the common folk felt the blessing of his discernment in their daily lives. His judgments reflected light that came not from intellect alone, but from communion with the divine. Every decision was an act of worship, every verdict a reflection of the God who had granted him understanding. The throne of Israel had become more than a seat of power. It was a beacon of righteousness shining before the nations. His wisdom extended beyond legal matters into the fabric of everyday life. He studied nature, spoke of plants, taught about animals and the mysteries of creation. Scholars and poets sought his counsel, and his words became a wellspring of reflection for generations. Wisdom in his hands was not an instrument of control, but a bridge between heaven and earth. Through him, divine truth touched human affairs, transforming ordinary governance into sacred stewardship. Even with such greatness, Solomon remained aware that wisdom is not self-sustaining. He understood that human judgment can easily tilt toward arrogance if the heart forgets its dependence on God. For a season, he kept that awareness alive, ensuring that every act of justice was accompanied by reverence. His discernment was a gift continually renewed through prayer and humility, and as long as his heart remained aligned with divine truth, his kingdom flourished in peace and prosperity. The story of the two mothers was more than a tale of judgment. It was a mirror reflecting the essence of divine wisdom, truth revealed through love, justice born from compassion. Solomon's throne became a symbol of how human leadership can reflect divine character when guided by spiritual light. His reign demonstrated that when wisdom governs, peace follows. When understanding prevails, harmony blooms among people. The echoes of that day in the royal court continued to remind Israel that God's wisdom shines most brightly when it flows through a heart committed to truth and mercy alike. Under Solomon's rule, Israel entered an age of prosperity unmatched in its history. The land flourished, trade expanded, and the streets of Jerusalem gleamed with vitality. Silver became as common as stones, and cedar wood, once a luxury, adorned countless homes. The kingdom stretched from the Euphrates to Egypt's border, its influence reaching far beyond its size. Peace had become the nation's companion, and wealth flowed like a river through its cities. The king's wisdom drew leaders from distant lands, eager to witness the harmony of a realm guided not by fear, but by insight. Jerusalem stood as a jewel among nations. The hum of markets filled its air. Merchants from Tyre and Arabia brought spices, gold, and fine linen, while craftsmen adorned the city with art that reflected the beauty of creation. Ships sailed from Etzion-Geber, carrying trade goods across the sea, returning with treasures that enriched not only the palace, but the entire people. Music echoed through courtyards, laughter resonated in the streets, and for a time, it seemed as though heaven had touched earth. Solomon's leadership had turned vision into reality, order into abundance, and faith into flourishing. Palaces rose with marble columns and golden roofs, testaments to the glory of his reign. Yet behind every shining wall, a subtle tension began to stir, a whisper reminding that prosperity can test the soul more severely than hardship. Solomon's wealth was immense, but so too was the responsibility it carried. Every blessing bore a silent question. Would gratitude keep pace with greatness? Would humility remain steady as luxury multiplied? Success, when left unchecked, often breeds the illusion of invincibility. In the heart of his palace, Solomon surrounded himself with beauty beyond measure. Gardens bloomed with exotic flowers brought from faraway lands, fountains shimmered beneath the sun, and the fragrance of incense drifted through marble halls. The artistry reflected not only the creativity of man, but also the generosity of God, who had granted abundance. Yet as splendor increased, the simplicity of devotion risked being overshadowed. The line between appreciation and indulgence grew thin, and the king who once sought only wisdom now stood amid temptations of pleasure and prestige. Diplomatic alliances expanded his influence across continents. Kings and queens sent tributes, recognizing his unmatched intellect and power. He received them with grace, offering counsel that amazed even the most seasoned rulers. The fame of his name carried across deserts and seas, and his words were recorded in scrolls treasured by the wise. But with admiration came adoration, and adoration can quietly alter perception. As others exalted Solomon, he faced a subtle danger, the slow erosion of perspective that comes when praise replaces prayer. At the height of his reign, the temple's construction was underway, and the people rejoiced. The house of God rose from stone and cedar, adorned with gold that reflected sunlight in radiant splendor. It was the physical embodiment of Solomon's devotion, the fulfillment of his father's dream. Yet even as the sacred project advanced, the palace beside it grew grander. The balance between divine honor and personal glory wavered, almost imperceptibly. Prosperity is often deceptive. It appears as a blessing, yet it tests whether the heart can remain centered on gratitude rather than pride. His wisdom continued to govern with brilliance, yet the temptations surrounding him multiplied. The peace he had built allowed luxury to blossom, but also comfort that dulled vigilance. The very success born from God's favor began to create the distance that prosperity often brings. As Israel basked in abundance, the quiet voice of dependence on God became fainter amid the chorus of wealth. Solomon had not yet fallen, but shadows began to lengthen across the bright horizon of his kingdom. Even so, this era of golden glory remains one of the most remarkable in all of history, a testament to what divine wisdom can achieve when applied to leadership and vision. Under Solomon's hand, Israel became a symbol of order, beauty, and blessing. The people dwelled in safety, their vineyards fruitful, their homes secure. Peace reigned, and the wisdom of their king became their shield. Yet woven within that peace was an unseen thread, a reminder that no amount of splendor can sustain the soul if gratitude fades. The story of Solomon's prosperity is both an inspiration and a warning. It reveals how divine gifts, when received with humility, bring harmony and joy, but when detached from their divine source, can slowly lead the heart astray. The king who once bowed before the altar at Gibeon now stood among treasures beyond imagination. And while his mind still shone with brilliance, the quiet test of his soul had only just begun. Morning sunlight cascaded over Jerusalem, bathing the rising structure in brilliance. Workers moved with rhythmic precision, their chants echoing across the hills as cedar beams from Lebanon were lifted into place. Stones, hewn and polished far from the site, fit perfectly together so that no sound of hammer or chisel disturbed the sacred ground. This silence carried profound meaning. It was as though the building itself was being shaped by divine order. Solomon's greatest vision was coming alive before his eyes, the temple that would stand as a dwelling place for the Almighty, a visible reminder of the covenant between heaven and Israel. Every detail, from the gold-lined chambers to the intricate carvings of cherubim, reflected reverence, devotion, and gratitude. From the moment Solomon conceived this sacred project, his heart was consumed by the desire to honor God as his father David had dreamed. Years of planning unfolded with unwavering purpose. Artisans, craftsmen, and priests worked together under his guidance, creating a sanctuary unlike any structure on earth. Walls glimmered with gold, doors bore intricate engravings of palm trees and flowers, and the inner sanctuary, known as the most holy place, was veiled with mystery and awe. Solomon's wisdom guided not only governance, but architecture. Each element carried spiritual symbolism. It was not merely a monument of wealth, but a reflection of divine perfection expressed through human hands. When the final stone was laid, an air of anticipation filled the city. Pilgrims journeyed from distant regions, bringing offerings of joy and gratitude. Trumpets sounded, priests robed in white ascended the steps, and Solomon stood before the vast assembly with a heart overflowing with reverence. The Ark of the Covenant, containing the sacred tablets of the law, was brought into the temple. As it was set in place, clouds descended from above, and the glory of the Lord filled the house, so that even the priests could not stand to minister. The presence of God had made his dwelling among his people, and the sight left all of Israel trembling with awe. Solomon lifted his hands toward heaven and began to pray, a prayer that would echo through centuries. His words were not born from pride, but from humility, acknowledging that even the heavens could not contain the Almighty, much less a temple built by human hands. He asked that God's eyes be upon that house day and night, that every prayer offered there would be heard, whether from an Israelite or a foreigner seeking truth. His plea was for mercy, forgiveness, and faithfulness, that no matter how far the people might stray, they could always turn their hearts toward this place and be restored. That dedication marked the pinnacle of Solomon's spiritual devotion. The temple stood as both fulfillment and warning, a fulfillment of divine promise, yet a reminder that no structure, however magnificent, could replace a heart truly devoted to God. As incense rose and the choir sang praises, an invisible boundary was drawn between worship and idolatry, between faith and formality. True worship could not be confined to stone walls. It required living obedience. The king understood this deeply then. Though time would test whether that understanding would endure, days of celebration followed. Music filled every street, sacrifices were offered in abundance, and the people rejoiced under clear skies. Israel had never seen such harmony, such unity of purpose. Joy radiated through the city like light through crystal, reflecting the peace that divine favor had bestowed upon the land. Yet within that very peace lay the quiet danger of complacency. When life is full and hearts are satisfied, vigilance often fades. Gratitude must be cultivated continuously, for abundance can dull awareness of dependence on God. Years passed, and the temple became the beating heart of Israel's spiritual life. Priests ministered daily, and pilgrims continued to come with offerings of thanksgiving. Solomon's fame grew, his writings flourished, and his wisdom became the counsel of kings. Yet, as the memory of Gibeon grew distant, a subtle shift began within his heart. The magnificence of the temple, meant to glorify God, began to blend with the magnificence of his own palace. The distinction between sacred and personal pride became less defined. It was not an open rebellion, but a gradual fading of reverence, a slow drift of focus from the giver to the gifts. Despite that shift, the temple remained a masterpiece of divine human collaboration. Its beauty inspired generations, and its message endured, that God desires not grand walls of gold, but hearts that remain faithful. Solomon had built the most glorious sanctuary on earth, yet the lesson it carried was not about architecture, it was about allegiance. The God who filled it with his presence was not confined within. He desired to dwell within the hearts of his people. For a time, Solomon knew this truth intimately, and under his leadership, Israel basked in both physical and spiritual prosperity. Far beyond Israel's borders, across deserts and mountains, tales of Solomon's wisdom spread like wildfire. Caravans carried his proverbs, merchants recited his judgments, and foreign kings marveled at the peace and prosperity of his reign. Among those who heard was a queen from the distant kingdom of Sheba, a land of wealth and mystery, rich in spices and gold. Her curiosity grew into determination. She resolved to see for herself whether the stories of Solomon were truth or legend. With a grand retinue, she journeyed toward Jerusalem, bearing precious gifts, treasures of her land fit for a monarch whose fame had reached the edges of the known world. When her caravan entered the city, its splendor astonished all who witnessed it. Camels laden with gold and fragrant spices wound through the streets, their perfume mingling with the sound of music and celebration. Yet behind her regal demeanor was a mind sharp and discerning, determined to test the wisdom she had heard so much about. Her heart sought not entertainment, but understanding, not rumor, but revelation. As she stood before Solomon, her eyes searched his face for any trace of arrogance. Instead, she found composure and calm strength. She began to question him, presenting riddles, mysteries, and dilemmas designed to challenge even the keenest intellect. Solomon answered each with ease, his insight unfolding with grace and clarity. The queen listened in awe as he spoke not only with knowledge, but with depth of spirit, weaving divine truth into every response. She saw that his wisdom was not confined to politics or philosophy. It extended to the very understanding of life, faith, and purpose. Her tour through his kingdom revealed prosperity beyond imagination. The organization of his servants, the harmony of his officials, The architecture of his palace and the magnificence of the temple all testified to order born from divine wisdom. She observed not chaos but peace, not extravagance for its own sake, but structure rooted in purpose. For a ruler accustomed to grandeur, it was the harmony that impressed her most. Every corner of Solomon's kingdom reflected not just wealth, but balance, the mark of a mind and heart, guided by something greater than human ambition. When her journey concluded, the Queen of Sheba confessed with wonder that what she had heard in her land had not been half of the truth. The reality surpassed every tale. She praised Solomon for his understanding, but she praised his God even more, recognizing that such wisdom could only come from divine favor. Her words revealed not mere admiration, but awakening, a moment when the light of revelation crossed boundaries of culture and nation. The encounter became a symbol of how divine wisdom draws seekers from afar, transcending borders and traditions. Her visit brought gifts of immense value, gold, spices, and precious stones, but what she received in return was far greater. She carried home the memory of a kingdom built on truth and justice, and a man whose discernment reflected the very character of God. Yet even as Solomon's fame spread further, admiration carried a quiet danger. Human praise has a way of lingering in the mind, feeding the illusion that wisdom belongs to the individual rather than to its source. The queen departed in wonder, and the king was left surrounded by accolades that began to feed his pride. As the days passed, admiration from other nations became more frequent. Tribute poured into Jerusalem, and Solomon's influence reached new heights. Foreign rulers sought alliances, offering their daughters in marriage to strengthen bonds of peace. What began as diplomacy soon turned into indulgence. His heart, once wholly devoted to God, began to divide. The adoration that had once glorified God now began to orbit around the man himself. This meeting with the Queen of Sheba stands as a moment of brilliance and warning alike. It displayed the fulfillment of divine promise, nations drawn to Israel's light, yet beneath that brilliance stirred the shadow of pride. When the world applauds wisdom, it becomes easy for the wise to forget where the light truly originates. Solomon's encounter with the Queen was both triumph and turning point, the final crest of spiritual greatness before the slow descent began. In the years that followed, Solomon's kingdom grew not only in wealth but in complexity. Treaties with neighboring nations multiplied, each sealed through marriage to a foreign princess. What began as political strategy soon became personal fascination. The royal household expanded into a labyrinth of alliances, affection, and influence. Foreign customs entered Jerusalem's gates, carrying with them gods, rituals, and symbols of worship that were alien to Israel's covenant. The man once devoted to the God of his fathers began to share his heart with those who did not know the truth. Each marriage brought beauty, intrigue, and power, yet also compromise. Solomon's wisdom, once unshakable, became clouded by affection for women whose hearts belonged to other deities. His palace filled with foreign altars, their incense mingling with the smoke of sacrifices once offered solely to the Lord. What began as tolerance turned into acceptance, and acceptance grew into participation. The same mind that once composed proverbs of divine truth now reasoned within itself that love could excuse disobedience. The line between diplomacy and devotion blurred beyond recognition. As the years unfolded, Israel watched in silence while its king drifted from the faith that had once defined his reign. The temple still stood in majesty, yet its meaning grew hollow as the king who built it began to honor other gods beside its sacred walls. Shrines rose on nearby hills, their fires burning to foreign names. The city of peace became the city of divided worship, and the man once called the wisest of all began to live in contradiction. Solomon's heart, once unified in purpose, became a field of competing loyalties. Each love pulled him in a different direction. Each alliance demanded a token of respect to its God. The strength of his devotion weakened under the weight of compromise. The wisdom that once discerned truth so clearly now served to justify indulgence. His thoughts became tangled, his peace unsettled, his purpose blurred. He had sought to unite nations through marriage, but had instead fractured his own soul. Despite the grandeur surrounding him, Solomon's spirit grew restless. The laughter of his wives, the music of his court, the glitter of gold, all could not silence the growing emptiness within. He had everything a man could desire, yet joy slipped through his fingers like sand. The voice that once guided him in dreams had grown silent, not because God had withdrawn his presence, but because Solomon had turned his heart elsewhere. The man who had asked for wisdom to lead God's people now struggled to lead himself. Foreign altars multiplied, each one a reflection of divided affection. Moloch, Ashtoreth, Chemosh, names once foreign to Israel, found place within its borders because the king's heart had opened doors that should have remained closed. The worship that once belonged to the Lord alone now competed with the noise of idols. What began as an act of tolerance became rebellion disguised as love. The harmony of the kingdom trembled as spiritual corruption seeped into the nation's core. Even amid disobedience, traces of Solomon's former wisdom surfaced like echoes from a forgotten past. He still spoke words of insight, still offered counsel, still carried the demeanor of a ruler, yet something vital had vanished. The light that once shone from divine communion had dimmed, replaced by the pale glow of human reasoning. Love, when divorced from righteousness, becomes deception, and Solomon, though surrounded by affection, had never felt more alone. The fall of his heart was not sudden. It was gradual, almost unnoticeable, like the slow fading of daylight. Each compromise seemed small, each decision justifiable, yet together they built a chasm between the king and his God. His story became a solemn reminder that wisdom, however vast, cannot coexist with disobedience. The man who once ruled by the light of heaven now walked beneath the shadow of his own desires, unaware that the peace he had built for his people was beginning to erode from within. Even as the sun rose over Jerusalem, its light seemed dimmer than before. The city still shone with gold, the temple still stood in splendor, and the songs of worship still echoed through the courtyards. Yet beneath the surface of beauty lay the corrosion of divided devotion. Solomon's heart, once bound to the God of his fathers, had become entangled in the web of foreign altars that now dotted the hills surrounding the city. The fragrance of incense once reserved for heaven mingled with the smoke of offerings to false gods. What had begun as curiosity had grown into corruption, and the man who once judged between truth and deception now could no longer discern the difference. Each new altar was a whisper of rebellion, quiet yet powerful. The idols stood in silence, their lifeless eyes staring over a kingdom that had once reflected divine order. Solomon walked among them, perhaps convincing himself that tolerance meant wisdom, that unity could be built through compromise. Yet every prayer offered to another god carried away a fragment of his soul. The peace of his mind dissolved into confusion, and his heart, once the seat of understanding, became a battlefield of conflicting loyalties. The presence of God, once vivid and near, seemed distant, as if the Spirit had withdrawn into the shadows, waiting for repentance that never came. Years earlier, Solomon had known the voice of God with intimacy, clear and unmistakable, guiding his choices, affirming his path. That voice had spoken at Gibeon, had filled the temple, had once echoed through his prayers with tenderness and power. Now it was silent. The absence was not punishment, it was consequence. When the soul fills itself with noise, the divine whisper cannot be heard. Solomon had surrounded himself with music, laughter, and counsel, yet all those sounds only deepened the silence where God's voice used to dwell. Jerusalem's hills became monuments of contradiction. One summit bore the shining temple, the house of the living God, where priests served in reverence. Another nearby hill held shrines to Ashtoreth and Chemosh, their fires burning through the night. From a distance, both glowed under the same sky, yet one radiated truth, the other deception. The people watched and followed their king's example, their faith wavering between devotion and indulgence. Spiritual decay rarely begins with rebellion. It begins with imitation, and as Solomon's devotion fractured, so did the heart of his nation. His wisdom, once his crown, became his burden. Knowledge without obedience turns against its bearer, cutting deeper than ignorance. Solomon could still reason, could still articulate truths, but his life no longer aligned with them. He had studied the nature of the world, written thousands of proverbs, and built wonders beyond imagination, yet he could not master his own desires. The wisdom that once made him great now condemned him, reminding him of the purity he had forsaken. Awareness without surrender is torment, and his brilliance became a mirror reflecting his fall. Wealth and grandeur continued to surround him, but joy slipped away like water through fingers. His palace felt vast and hollow, filled with people yet empty of peace. He had wives, concubines, counselors, servants, and guards, yet isolation wrapped around him like a cloak. The very blessings that once brought delight now mocked him. The laughter of those around him rang false, and the fragrance of foreign incense reminded him of how far he had drifted. Every corner of his kingdom bore witness to his greatness, yet his soul whispered of loss that no amount of splendor could conceal. Beyond the walls of his palace, prophets spoke of warning, voices rising like distant thunder. They called the nation back to purity, back to the covenant, back to the God who had chosen them. Solomon heard those voices, but did not respond. Pride, once absent from his heart, had taken root. He could not imagine himself as the one who needed correction, the one who had fallen. The throne had become a barrier between his heart and humility. His silence toward God became his greatest rebellion. Despite his disobedience, mercy still lingered, patient and waiting. God's covenant with David remained unbroken, though the favor upon Solomon began to fade. The peace of Israel wavered as the Lord stirred adversaries against him, small threats that grew with each act of disloyalty. What had once been protected by divine strength now stood exposed. The light of wisdom had dimmed, and with it, the stability of his kingdom. The voice of idols whispered promises of pleasure, but they delivered only emptiness, leaving Solomon surrounded by gold, yet impoverished within. Through his decline, one truth stood unshaken: wisdom detached from obedience becomes dust. The king who once brought justice now struggled with clarity. The man who once united tribes now divided his own heart. His life became a parable of how power, knowledge, and success cannot sustain the soul when faith is lost. The whisper of idols was gentle but deadly, eroding conviction grain by grain until even the wisest man could no longer see the path back to the one who had once spoken to him in the stillness of a dream. Years of splendor faded into weariness as Solomon grew old. His body bore the marks of time, but his soul carried the heavier burden of regret. The laughter of his youth had long disappeared, replaced by quiet reflection that filled the halls of his palace. Nights grew long, and in the solitude of his chamber, he began to see the emptiness behind his achievements. The golden walls no longer inspired pride. They reminded him of how far he had fallen from the purity of his beginnings. The wisdom that had once made him revered now tormented him with awareness of what he had lost. Memories rose like ghosts. His prayer at Gibeon, the day the temple was filled with God's glory, the moment he felt divine favor flow through him like light. Those memories, once sources of strength, now pressed upon him with sorrow. He remembered the sound of God's voice, the peace that came from obedience, and the clarity that guided every decision. Now, silence reigned where once there had been communion. Solomon looked back upon the path he had walked and saw a trail of altars that had no life in them, idols that had demanded devotion but given nothing in return. His writings became his confession. The words that poured from his pen no longer carried the triumph of a king, but the lament of a man who had tasted every pleasure and found it hollow. He wrote of vanity, of futility, of endless cycles where nothing under the sun could satisfy. He spoke not as a scholar, but as a soul awakened too late to its own emptiness. His reflections carried truth, but they also carried pain. The realization that wisdom without righteousness leads only to despair. He had gained the world's admiration, yet lost the peace that comes from divine fellowship. Loneliness became his companion. The halls once filled with song now echoed with his own footsteps. His wives and attendants moved around him like shadows, offering no comfort that could reach the depths of his heart. Wealth, music, art, and knowledge surrounded him, yet none of it restored the joy that had once come from God's presence. In moments of honesty, he saw that the idols he had served had not only divided his kingdom, but had fractured his very soul. He had sought fulfillment in abundance and found only weariness in excess. As his strength waned, Solomon began to see life through different eyes. The vanity of power revealed itself as fleeting illusion. Thrones crumble, empires fade, beauty withers, and only faith endures. He understood now that wisdom's true purpose was never to glorify the mind, but to direct the heart toward God. Without that anchor, all understanding collapses into confusion. The fear of the Lord, once his guiding light, had become distant, yet it now called to him again, softly but unmistakably. That call stirred repentance within him, not loud or dramatic, but quiet and sincere, like a dying ember remembering the warmth of flame. Israel's prosperity still lingered, yet cracks began to form beneath its surface. Political tensions stirred, neighboring nations grew bolder, and peace no longer seemed assured. Solomon recognized that the spiritual decay of his own life had begun to seep into the life of his kingdom. He had once been the embodiment of divine blessing, but now he was the mirror of its withdrawal. The consequences of divided devotion could not be undone, yet they taught him the lesson that pride and indulgence conceal until it is too late. Through his sorrow, clarity returned, not in triumph, but in humility. He saw that wisdom apart from God is a chasing after the wind, an endless pursuit that leaves the soul unsatisfied. The man who once ruled with divine insight now found wisdom in surrender. He began to see that the greatest understanding lies not in knowing all things, but in fearing the one who created them. His reflections on vanity were not cynicism, but revelation, an acknowledgement that without God, even greatness turns to dust. Each morning he watched the sun rise over the hills of Jerusalem, remembering the voice that had once said, "Ask what I shall give you." He had been granted everything, yet only now understood the true meaning of that gift. Wisdom was never meant to make him self-sufficient. It was meant to keep him dependent on God. That realization brought peace, not the peace of prosperity, but the peace of acceptance. His heart, once divided, slowly turned again toward the one he had forsaken. Though his reign would not recover its former purity, his soul began to find rest in the truth that the fear of the Lord is the beginning and also the fulfillment of wisdom. Age settled over Solomon like a veil, softening his strength but sharpening his understanding. The weight of his past no longer drove him to despair, but to reflection. He had walked through glory and ruin, wisdom and folly, faith and forgetfulness. The once proud monarch had been stripped of illusions, standing now before the truth of his own fragility. He understood that life, in all its splendor and pain, was a gift designed not to be mastered, but to be cherished in humility. Though his failures had scarred the kingdom, they also carved a deeper understanding within him, an awareness that even in disobedience, divine mercy remains near. His final years were not marked by conquest or creation, but by contemplation. He looked upon the temple still standing in majesty and realized that its beauty had never been about the gold or the craftsmanship. It had always been about the presence of God. The same presence that had once filled that holy place now reached toward his heart, patient and unchanging. The silence that had haunted him for so long began to feel different. It was no longer absence, but invitation. Through repentance, Solomon rediscovered the voice he thought had vanished, not in thunder or vision, but in stillness, reminding him that grace does not abandon even the fallen wise. As he pondered his life, his thoughts turned often to his father David, the shepherd who became a king, the sinner who became a man after God's own heart. Solomon saw now that his father's greatness had not come from perfection, but from repentance. That realization stirred a quiet comfort within him. Though his own reign had faltered, the covenant remained. God's promise to David would endure beyond his failures, beyond the fading of his crown. Out of his lineage would come a greater king, one who would embody perfect wisdom and unfailing love, one whose kingdom would never end. The palace halls that once echoed with celebration now carried the soft steps of an old man reflecting on eternity. Solomon's writings in those years spoke with a depth born of pain, transformed into understanding. He no longer sought meaning under the sun, for he had learned that meaning could only be found above it. Each word written in his later days carried the tone of a man who had seen both the heights of glory and the depths of regret, yet found peace in knowing that divine purpose had not been undone by human failure. Through his legacy, future generations would remember both his brilliance and his brokenness. His wisdom would continue to inspire, his proverbs would still teach, and his reflections in Ecclesiastes would echo as the cry of a soul that had learned the hard truth that life apart from God is emptiness. Yet his story would not end in despair, for even in his decline, a greater narrative was unfolding, a narrative of redemption written not by Solomon's hand, but by God's enduring faithfulness. Prophets would later speak of the lineage of David, of the promise that would blossom from it in due time. From that royal line, centuries later would come Christ, the true and perfect King, whose wisdom would not fade, whose heart would never divide, whose throne would endure forever. Through him, the lessons of Solomon's life found completion. Where Solomon faltered, Christ triumphed. Where the Son of David stumbled, the Son of God restored. Grace reached through generations, proving that human failure cannot silence divine promise. Israel, though fractured after Solomon's reign, would never be forgotten. The temple would fall, kingdoms would rise and collapse, yet the word of God remained steadfast. Even the memory of Solomon's mistakes would serve a purpose, warning against pride, urging devotion, and pointing to the only wisdom that endures. His story became a mirror for all humanity, reflecting how easily hearts can wander, yet how endlessly they are pursued by mercy. The golden kingdom may have faded, but the light of redemption born through his line would shine forever. As Solomon's life drew to its quiet close, peace finally returned, not the peace of triumph, but the peace of surrender. His wisdom, once celebrated by the nations, now rested in the simple truth that all is vanity except to fear God and keep his commandments. That truth, written through tears and years, became his final gift to the world. The man who had once been the wisest of kings left behind the humblest of confessions, that wisdom begins and ends with reverence, and that grace remains greater than any fall. His story endures not as a tale of failure, but of divine patience. It reminds every soul that no one stands beyond redemption, that the heart which turns back to God will always find him waiting. The arc of Solomon's life bends toward mercy, proving that God's love does not depend on perfection, but on repentance. From the dust of regret rises the beauty of forgiveness, and through that forgiveness, the legacy of wisdom lives on, not in the monuments of stone, but in the hearts of those who seek God with sincerity. Thank you for joining this journey through the life of Solomon, a story of wisdom, triumph, failure, and redemption. If this message moved your heart, remember to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another reflection filled with spiritual depth and insight. Like the video to help it reach more hearts seeking understanding, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your reflections, your faith, and your presence matter deeply. Share this film with those you love, so that together we may continue spreading light, truth, and hope to all who seek it.